Now, the decision by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to request possible arrest warrants for Israel and Hamas leaders over alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity has triggered quite the earthquake, to say the least. We've seen various threats, not least from the United States. We've seen the Israeli political establishment essentially combusting. We've seen many media outlets, not exactly, I would say, accurately representing what's happened. There's been so much misinformation and distortions about what's actually happened and what will happen next. So I think we need some facts, which is why I've got the perfect guest, Mark Kersten, who is a professor of international law and is also the University of Fraser Valley, also the WAMO Foundation. It's great to talk to you, Mark. How you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on, Owen.
Very good. Very good. Should we just start in terms of where we're at now, actually? Because some might not be, because the point is very important to say these are requests for arrest warrants. So some might just go, well, it already felt too good to be true. I think a year ago, if anyone thought Benjamin Netanyahu was going to have an arrest warrant to be tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think that you'd probably think they were pretty delusional. What happens next, and what are the precedents in terms of how unlikely is it that these charges, these arrest warrants won't be issued?
Yeah, good point. Like, how much has changed? Just incredible. Although I would say that there are some of us, myself included, who thought he deserved an ICC arrest warrant back then, long before October 7th. And it is, I think, interesting and important to note that actually all of the crimes that are and the charges that are laid out in the ICC prosecutor's request all relate to things around October 7th and afterwards. And maybe in due course, we'll see an expansion of some of that work, as well as expansion to some of the atrocities that we've seen in the West Bank. But you're absolutely right. This is just a request, and it's kind of unusual territory in some ways, because what we have is the ICC prosecutor giving a really comprehensive list of war crimes and crimes against humanity that he's alleging that 3 Hamas leaders and 2 Israeli leaders have committed. And he's putting that request to a panel of 3 judges, which we call the pretrial chamber at the International Criminal Court. And now they have to decide whether or not what he's put forward warrants the issuance of ICC arrest warrants. And so there's a couple of things to note here. One is the legal test, which is the pretrial chamber judges have to be convinced that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the individuals listed in the request committed the crimes that are listed in that same request. And that's a really low threshold. It's lower than the threshold that you'll see at the confirmation of charges hearing. And it's also obviously way lower than what you would need at a trial, which is beyond reasonable doubt. So for the most part, if we look at all of ICC history, it's not that difficult to meet that threshold. There may be some quibbling around the edges around, say, for example, if the judges have a question over, let's say, the charge of sexual violence in relation to Hamas, they may ask the prosecutor to kind of clarify those things, or they may ask in relation to starvation. They may ask the prosecutor to clarify what he's actually charging and how he's charging it. But there it's really important to know that the prosecutor also did something that is almost unprecedented, which he created a panel of experts, people like Marko Milanovic and Amal Clooney and Helena Kennedy and all of these other people to guide him through this process of making sure that once he issued the request to those pretrial chamber judges, they were as robust and as ready as possible. And if we think back, it's interesting to remember, like on Twitter and elsewhere, just how frustrated many of us, including myself, were that the ICC wasn't acting. It wasn't doing things quickly enough. And I remember I wrote a thread saying, the ICC doesn't tend to do things particularly quickly, but what really matters is that it's doing these things properly. And I think the way that it's done it with these experts and the comprehensiveness of the request likely means that the pretrial chamber judges will find it relatively easy to issue those arrest warrants. How long that'll take, it's anyone's guess. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks. I think in the case of Putin, where the arrest warrants were issued, it took less than a month. In other cases, it's taken a little bit longer. But in my view, at least, on the legal basis, it's a foregone conclusion that we'll see those arrest warrants issued in the coming weeks.
Now, we have seen a number of states come out and say and accept the ICC's legitimacy. Obviously, we're talking about signatory states here. So France has done that. Even Germany, which is Israel's main defender, Belgium, which actually, to be fair, has been relatively strident in defending or opposing what I would regard as very serious war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. Britain, all over the place, its government, as per, because the relevant minister back in November said it wasn't up for the government to decide the authority of the prosecutor, and now has completely contradicted himself. In the case of the US, so they basically tried to say the ICC has no jurisdiction. Israel isn't a signatory, neither is Russia. Obviously, they welcomed the arrest warrants issued against Vladimir Putin and one of his main allies, Russia's Minister for Children. And obviously, the point is there is jurisdiction in Palestine in the way there's jurisdiction in Ukraine. So is that's basically, so is basically their argument legally bunk?
Garbage. Just garbage. Politically, morally, and I guess most importantly for an institution like the ICC, just nonsense. And it's inconsistent. And you pointed it out on Twitter, and many other people have. And just to spell it out, the ICC has accepted that Palestine is a state. And frankly, Palestine is a state. The vast majority of states around the world accept that Palestine is a state. And every week, it seems that another one is going to accept it. The stronghold, quote unquote, strongholds that don't do this yet, primarily in Europe, Canada, the United States, they are also joining. I think I read that at least 5 European states like Spain and Belgium, are preparing to recognize Palestinian statehood, but it's already a state, and it's a state before the International Criminal Court. And what that means is the ICC has jurisdiction over Palestine, which means to the ICC, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So from that flows the fact that the ICC has jurisdiction over any citizen of Palestine. So anyone from Hamas or any Palestinian organization, the ICC has jurisdiction over them, even if their crimes are committed in a non-member state. So it does not matter that Hamas fighters committed atrocities in Israel when they broke through on October 7th. They're citizens of Palestine, therefore the ICC has personal jurisdiction. The ICC also has territorial jurisdiction, so has jurisdiction over any atrocities committed in Palestine, which is, again, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, irrespective of the nationality of the person who's committed the atrocities. So if an Israeli or an American or someone who's got a citizenship from a non-member state of the ICC comes into Gaza and commits war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide, the ICC has jurisdiction. And that's really not up for debate. And then, as you've rightly pointed out elsewhere, the point is made so inconsistently. And I wanted to kind of point out two. One is, you're absolutely right, around Ukraine. One, Ukraine is not a member state of the ICC. I think a point that many people forget. It's accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. And of course, Russia has invaded it on multiple occasions, in particular 2014 and 2023. And those states, like the US in particular, that have pretended, in a sense, to claim that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over citizens of non-member states, have, of course, welcomed the arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, even though he is a citizen of Russia, which is not a member state of the ICC. The other thing is, the United States doesn't recognize Palestine as a state, which means that it doesn't think that Palestine can join the ICC. My own country, Canada, also does not think that Palestine is a state and therefore can't join the ICC. Now, if you follow that thread, if you agree with the US and say, okay, Palestine is not a state, therefore it's not a state before the ICC, then the ICC can't, in the eyes of the United States, issue arrest warrants for Hamas leaders because they're citizens of a state that cannot be a member of the court. So it's at this point, it's ludicrous to continue suggesting that this is the case. What it actually is just pseudo-legal speak for a position that's attempting to justify arrest warrants for Hamas and Russian officials, but not for U.S. allies. And frankly, I think that's completely, in some ways, understandable on the part of the U.S. If the ICC issues arrest warrants against Israeli leaders and they accept it, that's more or less accepting that they've apologized, armed, and allied with perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of course, they're not going to do that, because to accept that those individuals have committed those crimes is to accept that American officials and the Biden administration is complicit in those very same crimes.
Before I ask you about that, and actually just the wider US response, the other claim made actually by the US, but also I noticed by Germany, which even though it accepted the ICC jurisdiction, did so, I would say, begrudgingly. And in that one of the arguments they've made, which keeps coming up, is this idea that the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, has made an equivalence between Hamas and Israel. Now, I actually don't want to get bogged down in the details of Hamas committed serious crimes for which there was no justification. I would note Israel has clearly killed far more people and responsible for far more destruction, and there's an occupier-occupied dynamic, but I don't need to get into that. The point I'm making is he hasn't made an equivalence, has he? Because it's not about, he's not compared the behavior of the two, he's compared the behavior both to the law.
Yeah, I don't know where this equivalence argument comes from, but I just saw a tweet that collated, I think, 15 or 20 responses from US Congress people, all of which made this point on equivalence. And it's not an argument. It's certainly not a legal argument. Adil Haq has pointed out, who I think everyone should follow on these issues as well. Adil Haq has pointed out that that's not what the prosecutor does, and they can't do that. They don't take perpetrators and then, kind of say, well, let's make sure that there's an equivalent number of charges or whatever. That's not what the prosecutor can do. It's about whether the individual who's being investigated has committed the crimes or not. You have to follow the evidence. You can't follow a kind of political desire to compare perpetrators against each other. In fact, if anything, the equivalence comes in when the ICC investigators are trying to treat victims and survivors of atrocities equally, right? Is to take what happened to them as being both valid and deserving of investigation. And I think at the end of the day, the most important equivalence is children die and children starve the same way, irrespective of the color of their skin or the color of the flag that their country waves, right? That's what matters here, not this weird statement that says, well, the prosecutor's wrong because he's drawing an equivalence. The other thing that I would say on this is I think it's a complete red herring. I don't think that these people putting out these messages on, decrying the ICC prosecutor's request as somehow drawing an equivalence would be satisfied if the ICC prosecutor issued 1,000 arrest warrants for Hamas leaders and 1 for an Israeli official. They're not trying to talk about whether or not there is some proportionate balance to be struck. They're just making this point to falsely draw us into this idea that there might be, when in fact what they really want is full-blown impunity for these perpetrators and for the ICC to not do anything and go back to the status quo that we've seen for so many years that is so untenable, which basically says Israeli perpetrators of international crimes deserve full-blown impunity. And that's what the equivalency argument's about. It has nothing to do with the equivalency of perpetrators or victims or survivors. I think it has to do with everything, and everything to do with protecting Israeli officials from any kind of scrutiny from the ICC.
Now, the US Republican Representative Chip Roy's introduced a bill to sanction ICC officials who investigate US citizens or allies. The likes of John Bolton, lovely chap, he said he proposed this. Well, he did. He was former national security advisor and said he backs that. Blinken, the Secretary of State currently, has talked about the administration worryingly working with Congress on an appropriate response, as he puts it, to the ICC. Here's what we're talking about here, because Article 70 of the Rome Statute basically talks about impeding, intimidating, and corruptly influencing an official of the court for the purpose of forcing or persuading the official not to perform and to perform improperly his or her duty. I mean, are they just basically taking the piss out of international law here?
John Bolton, just on John Bolton, when he was national security advisor, as you mentioned, under the Trump administration, that was having a hissy fit over whether the ICC would investigate the United States and its enhanced interrogation, in air quotes, enhanced interrogation techniques in Afghanistan. John Bolton said, made this famous speech where he said, the ICC is dead. Whoops. Doesn't seem very dead to me, John. But in any case, do I think they're taking the piss of out of international law? I mean, yes and no. I think we need to see U.S. responses to the ICC in context. And it's always been a kind of turbulent relationship. When the ICC was first created, the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, issued pretty coercive diplomatic tactics. They tried to convince, and John Bolton was there too, they tried to convince through coercive forms of diplomacy dozens of states and threatened dozens of states with repercussions to withdraw various forms of aid if they even joined the International Criminal Court. And one of the most remarkable things is that those states said, well, I'm still going to join, many of those states. And today, I think we have 124 member states of the ICC. Then we have kind of cooling off periods. Whenever the ICC's decision-making aligns with U.S. interests, the U.S. then says, oh, no, it's fine. So that's what you get in Ukraine. You also saw that in Darfur, right, when the ICC issues arrest warrants for Omar al-Bashir. The U.S. actually kind of supports that because it aligns with their interests. So when the ICC is hunting Joseph Kony in the Central African Republic and Uganda, etc., the United States is happy to support that. And then whenever it kind of steps on the toes of the United States, as it did in Afghanistan, or its close allies like Israel, you get this absolutely virulently kind of hypocritical but also bombastic hissy fit of a response. And what I think is so interesting, so I've been tracking the U.S. relationship with the ICC for a very long time. And what's interesting here, to me at least, is that we as observers also tend to, in a sense, say, oh, this is terrible. It's so bad that the U.S. is acting in this way. And of course, that's true. It is terrible that they're acting in this way. But if we look at other states and people around the world, especially in what the quote unquote global South, they seem to very often view the US's overreaction to the ICC as actually a positive for the ICC. They signed up to the ICC, and many people believe in the ICC because it's supposed to be an independent institution that does challenge global powers, rather than it, kowtows to them when they're bullied. And so even now, when we're seeing this discussion and the US is so flagrantly trying to threaten and sanction ICC staff and use this, heightened rhetoric against the ICC, I think there's a whole constituency around the world that says, well, that's exactly what we thought you would do. We thought you would be, we thought you would be the loose cannon, but good on the ICC. Because when you're really worried about it over these atrocities, that probably means that the ICC is doing the right thing. The alternative is the US gets really close with the ICC, right? Is very supportive of the ICC, yet won't join the ICC. And that, I think, really offends those states that have sacrificed, a little piece of their sovereignty to be part of this court, yet have the US determine so much about it. So I think in a weird way, the intensity of the U.S. response to the court's actions actually bolsters its legitimacy in most of the world. What that'll hopefully translate into is those states around the world standing up and saying, I really do support the court in this instance. This is what it should be doing. And whether or not some have done that, whether the others do remains to be seen. But I think it's a really important moment. And I don't think we can forget that it wasn't that long ago when the primary narrative around the ICC was that it was a neo-colonial institution, in the pockets of Western powerful states. And it's not just the ICC prosecutor's decision-making that challenges that narrative. The U.S. response, and as you mentioned before, the British response to it also challenges that narrative, right? Because those are precisely the states that the ICC was supposed to be, quote unquote, in the pocket of, that are most upset about the ICC acting independently. And frankly, I'm not saying it's all roses. I think those sanctions are real and deplorable, et cetera, from the US. But I think it's also a positive story about the ICC and its growth and its maturity at a time when it's, frankly, most needed to do that.
It's interesting because Karim Khan, the prosecutor, said that he was told by a senior Western leader, this court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, and said, we don't view it like this. This court is the triumph of Nuremberg. This court is a sad indictment of humanity. This is the triumph of law over power and brute force. Could you explain, again, just before in terms of just where this goes, the difference between a war crime and crime against humanity? Because obviously it discusses war crimes and crimes against humanity. What's the distinction?
Yeah, so war crimes are obviously, there's an overlap there, but war crimes are the kinds of atrocities that we have to see either in an international armed conflict, so a conflict between states, which the ICC prosecutor said existed between Palestine and Israel, or a non-international armed conflict, which the ICC prosecutor said existed between Hamas and Israel. And there, war crimes are broadly governed by international criminal law and international humanitarian law, and it has all of these series of rules, right? You obviously can't target civilians, but then, military operations have to be proportional. You have to respect the principle of distinction. And so there's a whole lattice work of kind of analysis you have to show in order to say X is a war crime. And I think that's what we've been primarily focused on since October 7th, both for Hamas and Israel's on war crimes. And then there's been this other question, in particular, because of the case at the International Court of Justice. Mm-hmm. We've also been focused on, as observers and legal observers, on whether or not what is happening in Gaza constitutes genocide. The crime that's kind of dropped out of the bottom is crimes against humanity. And I think that's a shame, because they're so powerful from a kind of expressive point of view, what they actually are trying to say, what the theory of crimes against humanity say, and also because of the legal rules that the prosecutor has to show in order to prove a crime against humanity. So very briefly, crimes against humanity and genocide kind of grew up as ideas at the same time. Genocide clearly focuses on the group, right? It says that the crime of genocide is committed when there is intent and then an effort to eradicate a group, a particular kind of group in whole or in part. Crimes against humanity takes a different tact. It actually, its theory, its ethos, right? What underpins it, its belief, like the belief systems or whatever you want to call it, that underpin crimes against humanity are very different. They don't focus on simply the direct targets of the atrocity. What crimes against humanity are supposed to kind of evoke is that whatever crime, atrocity is happening, if it's a crime against humanity, it's a crime against all of us, because we share in this humanity. And I think that's really powerful and something that we've missed, and I hope gets a little bit more attention, that the starvation, whether it's starvation or torture or murder or extermination or persecution or whatever the atrocities we're talking about in this context are, that they are not just atrocities that were committed on October 7th in Israel or since and before that in Gaza. They're not just crimes against those people. They're crimes against our moral code and our sense of shared humanity. And the second bit that's really interesting and I think important is that in order to show that a crime, say murder, is a crime against humanity, a prosecutor has to show that the crime was committed in a widespread or systematic manner. And in this instance, the prosecutor actually said widespread and systematic manner. So both elements are achieved, right? It's this idea that there's something systematically happening against this particular population, and again, in some ways against all of us. And I think that really matters because so many people clearly care about the victims and survivors and the people and the civilians in Gaza, and we should. And this crime against humanity is a way for us to kind of locate how to care about that, also in the language of law. And that any prosecution that subsequently comes on crimes against humanity should reaffirm that this was a violation of again, as I said, our shared sense of humanity that was directed against a particularly vulnerable population.
Notwithstanding the fact that this is clearly a vindication for those who were very clear from the very start that a terrible crime has been committed against the Palestinian people and were vilified and ostracized and attacked and meant their careers menaced for saying so. Notwithstanding that, there has been some disappointment about the lack of other charges. For example, torture. There's, I would say, overwhelming evidence relating to the torture of Palestinian detainees. In fact, there's actually, I mean, the CNN did a big piece about this the other week. The point there you made about genocide as well. Obviously, there's an ongoing case at the International Court of Justice. I mean, it's notable that, you know, in his statement, he talks about how the onslaught against Gaza was, in terms of the criminality, rose from a desire to collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza, whom they perceived as a threat to Israel. But it's not hard to jump from that to genocide, is it? If you're defining a civilian population as a threat, then I mean that's the underlying basis really for genocidal behavior mentality. What's your thoughts on that? I mean, could that, and also the other disappointment is only 2 Israeli figures. I mean, obviously, you know, there's the war cabinet. So it's Israeli. So you've got Netanyahu and you've got, you know, Gallant, because people might go, well, you know, people talk about Ben Gvir or Smotrich, but they're not in the war cabinet. That's what people would say. What do you think, though? I mean, about those? Not enough charges, not enough people being charged on the Israeli side.
Got to start somewhere, right? You really have to start somewhere. And I'm going to come back to the point that I made earlier, is that, you know, people were upset that this was taking too much time.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And you can't do everything all at once, especially if you do not have access to the crime scene, which the ICC investigators do not have, right? They did not investigate on the ground in Gaza, or as I understand it, in Israel. So they had to build cases around things like interviews with medical professionals and interviews with survivors who I suppose either came to The Hague or perhaps were interviewed online in some forum, interviews with humanitarian aid organizations, etc. And they had to build these cases without actually being there. And I think they felt a certain degree of need to do this relatively quickly. And so this is the starting point. And I think that's what people should see it as. They should see it as a starting point, but I also think they should see it as a very comprehensive starting point, right? You have multiple counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity in these charges. It's a very comprehensive set of crimes, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of those. So a couple of things here. It's not without precedent that additional arrest warrants can be issued. I think, for example, looking at the Ukraine situation, Putin is only wanted, I say only, but it is a horrific atrocity, but he is singularly wanted for the forcible transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia or Russian-held territory, right? He's not, there aren't additional charges against him. I think it's pretty obvious that at some point Putin will face additional charges other than that, right? Because the situation in Ukraine is so much more, there's so much more going on in terms of atrocities than that. If you look back further, the initial arrest warrants for former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir were only for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And then about a year or two later, genocide was added. So it's not without precedent that you would add these. And I think it's very likely that those will be added. And I think you're absolutely right, Owen, to highlight that the prosecutor himself suggested an open-ended conversation and investigation, right? This is one stage, but they were continuing to look at certain things. And of course, those can be added and certain things can be dropped, right? If they find that actually on one particular count, it's not especially strong, they can also drop it, right? We're not at a kind of end stage here at all. Of course, the other thing that I wanted to kind of touch on is Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And if I was them, I wouldn't travel to an ICC member state anytime soon. And the reason why is because I think there's at least a distinct possibility that there are sealed arrest warrants that were also requested. So I don't think it was possible for the ICC to issue sealed arrest warrants for Netanyahu or the defense minister or any of the Hamas leaders. Why? Because there was an expectation that he act, there's an expectation that he was transparent about it, And because in the ICC, I think there's kind of an unspoken policy that if you're going for the head of government or one of what we call the, the troika, the three main characters in a government, like a defense minister, that in that instance, you do it transparently and openly, that you don't kind of try to undermine a regime entirely and try to change the regime by sealed arrest warrant. In this instance, it probably wouldn't work anyways because Israel has incredibly sophisticated intelligence capacities. But I don't think that's true for lower level ministers or lower level individuals. So I don't know if this is the case, but, and this goes back to a point that you and I were talking about, the case against Smotrich and Ben Gvir is pretty slam dunk on a bunch of different types of atrocities because they're so open about them, right? Yeah. Like it would not require much to sit. You don't even have to charge them with genocide. Just charge them with the incitement of genocide. And this is say what they said, yeah.
It's a real slam dunk point that because the argument can be made against against the ICC as well. This is meant to be used in dictatorships where you don't have a functioning legal system and where there isn't redress, and Israel has that, and obviously that's clearly not happening in terms of accountability. But with incitement is actually a slam dunk case because the ICJ issued a provisional order telling Israel to take action against incitement to genocide, which its own judge sitting on the ICJ voted for. And not only that, 948, for those who were genocide convention, for those who were, has 5 criminalized offenses. One of them is genocide. One of them is public incitement to genocide. Israel put that into law in 1950. They actually put public incitement to genocide on the same legal footing as genocide. It's actually a capital offense in theory in Israel, which few people know. But the point is, they haven't taken action at all. So actually, public incitement is a serious offense because it creates a culture. Genocide start with words. That's the point, isn't it? And they haven't taken action.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like that kind of goes to a point of why is it that we see Israeli, civilians blocking aid to Gaza? Why do we see soldiers acting so deplorably, destroying children's toys? It's because there's a culture in which it's understood that there will be no repercussions for this. People act like jerks when they think they can get away with it. People commit atrocities, foot soldiers commit atrocities or other outrageously offensive acts when they think there will be no repercussions. And this is the case on steroids, because not only do they do these outrageous acts, they upload them. They upload them to video for everyone to see.
They brag about them for amusement.
They're TikToks, right? They're just horrific, atrocity-oriented TikToks. And the only other time that I can think of someone doing this so openly, well, there's a couple. One, in Libya, somebody called Mahmoud al-Verfali filmed his own extrajudicial executions of prisoners and had his team upload it, right? Because it was like a trophy to him. And we also saw other terrorist groups and other groups who do similar things where their atrocities become trophies. They become recruitment material. Hey, come and you can also destroy stuff or watch universities crumble or whatever it is. There's something exciting about it. But what I'm saying in a sense is that that's all linked back to this incitement and culture of impunity. Those people only do that in the manner that they do and film themselves if they truly believe that there either be no repercussions or worse, the repercussions will be positive.
Well, I just on that because you're a busy man, so I want to ask you one final question before I let you go. But it's just come out that today, it's not only because people have noted these aid trucks are being attacked while the Israeli police do nothing, the Israeli authorities do nothing. It's come out today, The Guardian has an exclusive that members of the security forces are giving settlers who intercept vital supplies information on locations of convoys. Israeli soldiers and police are tipping off groups that attack the aid groups. I think that's just goes into that, further cements that point. Just finally, endgame, basically. Where does this all lead? I mean, partly what you just said about, well, if US officials come out and say, well, if they have to do this, otherwise they admit their complicity. Could this have a ricochet effect where you just should US and British politicians be worried? There is a criminal investigation which has been opened by lawyers in Britain for that reason. Should they be worried? And where do you think, this ends in terms of Israeli leaders I mean, if they, they might just not go on many. That's the end of their holidaying in Switzerland.
Yeah, so I think we need to recognize, and this touches on what you just talked about, The Guardian, how our conversation about what's been happening in the day-to-day brutality. I mean, we're here not because anyone has succeeded. We're here because almost everyone has failed. This is an important, vindication of ICC justice and accountability, but it's a condemnation of humanity and the international community that this is even necessary, right? So I think we need to keep that in mind, and keep in mind that the ICC is not enough to change that culture where things like sharing information to disrupt aid trucks, or the culture of impunity that leads people to film their destruction of children's toys in Gaza will change. There has to be more, right? We're really talking about an important slice of the pie, but a relatively small slice of the pie. In terms of, what the kind of end game is here, I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, all of the member states of the ICC will have a clear obligation to enforce any ICC arrest warrants. That's clear. They will be under that obligation. Whether or not they do so remains to be seen. And your ricochet question, remind me what it was. It was a really interesting.
British and American politicians, should they be worried about the fact that they supplied weapons and diplomatic support and public support for a state which, in theory, could have its leaders convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity?
So, not directly. I don't think so I guess yes and no. So I don't think the ICC is going to issue arrest warrants for Joe Biden because of aiding and abetting atrocities in Gaza. I don't think that's going to happen. Or Rishi Sunak or Justin Trudeau. Right? I just don't think that's the pathway. But I contributed to the early stages of an effort to sue Canada over its sale of armaments to Israel. Right? And when colleagues were putting together the legal arguments, they were working with certain things that the UN had said, certain facts, right? You're putting all these legal facts together, and you're saying, here's the clear risk that your weapons will be used for X, Y, and Z. So we need either further information, or you have to stop doing this, etc. We need a change in policy. And I think there is where the domestic efforts in these states that supply weapons and support to Israel and Hamas could be put under much more significant pressure. Because thinking back on when we were doing this, which I think was in November or December, it would have been tremendously useful for us to say, you can't do this because that government is led by two individuals who are wanted by the International Criminal Court, to whom you owe obligations. So I think it makes those legal arguments stronger. And in fact, I think that's the better route. I think that Canada and the United States should be held to account, not just to the international community or to the people of Palestine over this. They need to be held to account to us as Canadians, Americans, Brits, etc. Not in my name, right? Not in my name. Again, this goes back to this really important point that it's our shared humanity that is at stake. It is a rules-based order that is at stake. And when these states are providing the fuel and fodder for atrocities, they're hurting people abroad, but they're not abiding by the very laws that we set in place in these countries to ensure that that wouldn't happen in our name. And so I really hope that, if there is this kind of ricochet effect that you allude to or you speak about, it is one that galvanizes domestic clarity, national clarity over the moral and legal way forward, which is to end this war, end the suffering, hold everyone who has committed atrocities to account, and to hopefully, out of the ashes of this horrific failure of the international community and in some ways humanity, to build something better. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think in this business, you kind of have to be a little bit optimistic that at least it's possible. And yeah, so I'm going to retain that hope.
Well, when discussing this horror, I've always tried my best to try and cultivate some optimism amidst such terrible, often profound despair. And I'm glad we were able to end on that point. Mark, honestly, it's been such an honor, such clarity, nuance, really went into the weeds. I found that so unbelievably educational. I'm sure everyone listening has. So do share this video, leave your comments, subscribe, press like, all good for the algorithm so other people listen. But thank you to you, Mark. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Owen, and thanks, for all of the work you do here in The Guardian and everywhere to address tough problems. I think I have a profound amount of respect for people who stick their heads out for others. And I think it's because you believe in that common humanity and they believe in that common humanity. And we have the hope that it could be different. But I also know that for those who are listening, who do this work, that it's not always easy. You will get attacked. You'll get the name, be called certain things that are horrible. But I think, just all my respect to you, Owen, all my respect to other people who really try to do this work, not just for themselves, but for others. And I think that's where the hope lies, right? And it's that if there's enough of us, then maybe something different and something better is possible.
Well, as I always say, I'd never forgive myself if I did anything else. And I think it's damning that those who know what horror is happening and when they don't speak out. And Absolutely. Whatever we're up against, I always think, look what the journalists of Gaza, look what they have endured when trying to be the eyes and the ears of the world. And without them, Absolutely. Much of the evidence being accumulated would never have been possible. And some of them have sacrificed, they've been forced to sacrifice their lives, and their children have been slaughtered in the meantime. So, but thank you to you, Mark, Absolutely. And all the lawyers out there who've all made this possible. Thank you.